Chapter 28. After a week of nightly kisses and nothing else, Eiji was beginning to wonder if a person could die of frustration. Even as he marched his empty cart towards the galley, all he could think of was the way he had ached last night, the way he had feared he might cry as he made his nightly offer. It had been refused so gently. That was almost the worst of it, the constant gentleness, the way Lord Felix cradled him and breathed his name like a benediction and kept leaving him notes. Every sign seemed to point towards the god feeling interest in him. But every night Eiji offered his body up for his master's use, and every night he was gently, maddeningly rejected. Today, in particular, Eiji couldn't stand it. He returned his cart and peeled potatoes, but his mind was a storm of confusion. Finally, he shoved the remaining potatoes away and marched over to Rokuro's station. "I need to talk to Zenji." Eiji hadn't realized it was true until it left his mouth. "Is he here?" "He's in his office." Rokuro pointed, looking a little bewildered, and Eiji softened his tone and thanked him before heading off in the indicated direction. He hadn't been in Zenji's office before, and hoped he wasn't knocking foolishly on the door to a pantry. However, he was still halfway through his knock when the older man's voice called out. "Come in," he said, and Eiji obeyed. Zenji's office was a cramped little space that Eiji suspected had started life as a pantry, given that there were still shelves on the walls. Instead of foodstuffs, however, the shelves contained books and astonishing amounts of loose paper. More paper was scattered over the small desk Zenji sat behind, and the rest of the space was devoted to a little chair. He gestured for Eiji to sit. "What can I do for you?" Zenji asked, his tone more businesslike than Eiji was accustomed to anymore. "Do you want to change your shifts?" "Nothing like that, Zenji." Shit. In the face of the other man's easy authority, Eiji had almost addressed him as my lord. His face heated as he slumped into the chair with less grace than he would usually permit himself. Zenji snorted. "Apparently that was my barking orders voice. Sorry. What did you actually want to talk about?" "I had a question about Lord Felix," Eiji admitted. He half expected Zenji to refuse. The man was obviously busy working. Even if he weren't, he was under no obligation to humor his friend's stupid slave who couldn't manage to figure things out on his own. However, Zenji just looked up from his papers, one eyebrow quirked inquisitively. "Yes?" Eiji took a breath, emboldened. "Well, you see, he won't use me in bed." For a long moment, the older man just stared. Finally, when Eiji was getting well and truly nervous and could barely suppress the need to squirm, Zenji passed a hand over his face and groaned. "Bunto warned me this was going to happen." Sorry, Eiji stammered. What punishments had he heard of Zenji giving out? 1. Cleaning his office. 2. Was there a second one? So much for soothing lists. Zenji sighed and dropped his hand, leaning forward to give Eiji his full attention. "Well, I suppose it can't be helped. I'd certainly rather have you come to me than Norio. What are you asking, exactly?" Damn, this was hard. "My lord has been generous with his attentions. He kisses me." "Is that a problem?" Zenji raised an eyebrow. "Do you need me to tell him to stop?" "If Eiji lost the kisses, he would die." "No, of course not. It's far more of an honor than I deserve." Zenji smirked. "More than just an honor, if that blush is any indication." Eji's cheeks heated even further. Yes, well, my lord is clearly affected by these kisses, but he has not granted any of my requests to be permitted to relieve his desires." "I see," Zenji sighed. Even though I'm now being forced to think about Felix's erection, which is not how I wanted this day to go, I might have some insight for you after all. How are you asking? What words are you using? Can you be exact for me? It was humiliating to recite the phrases he'd used to beg for his master's touch in front of this authoritative egg of a man, but Eiji had asked for his help. He steeled himself, stared into his lap, and started mumbling. I'm just asking normally. It would be my greatest honor if my lord would use me. Please allow your servant to display his training. That sort of thing. Zenji winced. I think that might be your problem. Those are some very formal terms. But what else would I say? Was he supposed to be explicit? Did Lord Felix like dirty talk? Eiji wasn't sure he'd be any good at that, but if it was what his master required, he'd have to try. Well, for starters, you could tell him that you want it. Zenji paused and regarded him carefully. I assume that since you came to ask me about it in the middle of my workday, you want it. Yes, sir. All right, then you should say as much. I couldn't make demands of my lord like that, Eiji cried, scandalized. It wouldn't be a demand, said Zenji. You'd just be providing him with some important information. But my insolent wants are hardly important information worthy of my master's consideration, Eiji protested. Zenji's face softened. He looked suddenly sad, and Eiji wondered what he'd done to upset the older man. When he spoke again, Zenji's voice was painfully gentle. Has Felix ever given you the impression that he's uninterested in even the smallest of your wants and needs? He asked. Eiji fell silent, the hot rush of indignation cooling a little in his mind. What answer could he give? Yes, his master had always given every indication that he valued Eji's desires to a frankly uncomfortable degree, but that didn't mean Eiji could just disregard everything he knew about the way the world worked. Lord Felix could say that water was solid, and Eiji would bow and agree, but he wouldn't try to step onto a wave. You desiring something is absolutely vital information for him, Zenji said, even more gently. Even if it weren't, do you really think he would be angry with you just for asking? Yes! It was hard to picture Lord Felix angry, but it was harder yet to imagine that Eiji could just do something so shameless and face no consequences. Still, he had come here and interrupted Zenji's workday to ask for advice. He ought to at least consider the advice he'd been given. However, but how would I even begin to phrase something so brazen? Eiji moaned. There weren't any words for what he was asking beyond those he was already using, were there? What more could he say? Smiling, Zenji reached over the desk to pat his shoulder. It's not hard. After so many years, Bunta and I usually just say something like, want to get off? But you don't have to be that indelicate. You could try saying, I want to bed you. That was hardly less indelicate. It centered Eiji in a way that made him uncomfortable, made his god into something for him to act upon. That was so wrong it made his skin crawl. His reservations must have shown on his face, because Zenji sighed again. Fine. What about, I want us to make each other feel good, or I'd like to be close to you? Those are practically poetry. But where is the respect? Eiji demanded. That's how you and your lover address one another. That's not a way a slave could ever address a god. Exactly, Zenji replied, pitiless. He doesn't want to bed you if it'll be a slave's service to his god. He came to me bubbling over with excitement because you'd agreed to let him court you. Court you, Eiji. He wants you for his lover, not his plaything. But I am a plaything. He'd been trained his whole life to be a plaything, a lovely, pleasing one that could even tempt a god. To be a lover, That was something he had no frame of reference for. He didn't know how he would even start trying to make himself into one. Zenji gave him an encouraging smile that grated like sandpaper. He adores you, Eiji. Don't be afraid to let him prove it. I am meant to serve. I am not meant to be adored or courted. Why does everyone act like I should just accept? How can I not be afraid? The words seemed to tear at his mouth as he released them. My lord is showering me with honors I could never earn, not even if I were the best attendant the temple ever produced. How can I just accept all this as my due and not be afraid that some terrible reckoning is coming? Zenji opened his mouth, but now that Eiji had started, he couldn't bring himself to stop. He does all this because he wants me to be something I'm not, when he realizes that I can never be his relaxed, teasing lover. What will happen to me? Every day I'm racking up a debt I have no way to repay. He's going to... Eiji broke off because, in truth, he had no idea what he feared his master would do. He couldn't picture Lord Felix beating him, casting him out, locking him up, killing him, or any of the other things he feared. But he couldn't shake the feeling that these things would just somehow happen, even without the gods' involvement. They were what became of offerings who failed to please. It was like a law of nature, inevitable and merciless. Zenji's voice suddenly broke in on his cacophony of thoughts. When he looked up, he saw the older man staring at the ceiling, speaking in a musing tone as if he'd entirely forgotten Eji's presence. After I left Lord Antony's service, I was a wreck. Felix came to ask whether I wanted a master or a work detail, and I didn't even let him finish speaking. I never wanted to belong to anybody but myself ever again. It worked fine for a while. I had a good head for organization, and I worked hard. Why not? There was nothing else I cared about. But then the cadre that replaced mine started circulating more freely around the ship, and I met Bunta. I hate thinking back on the ways I hurt that man. The first time we kissed, I ran away. When he said he loved me, I avoided him for a week. Every time I let myself think about what I was starting to feel for him, it was like my whole body turned to ice. I was that scared. I came to realize that need and love and ownership were this awful tangle in my mind, and every time I felt like I was falling in love with Bunta, I ran away so I wouldn't have to start untangling. It was too much. Eiji couldn't imagine this powerful, confident man being afraid of anything, but the pain on his face was too raw for this to be anything but the truth. Zenji went on. Finally, Bunta said he wasn't going to be treated that way forever, and I had to make up my mind one way or the other. I knew I couldn't bear to lose him. I shaped up, somewhat. We stay together most nights, but I'm scared to leave any of my things in his room permanently, even though he's asked. He's also asked me to marry him, and I know his Lord Theo would marry us in a heartbeat, but I'm too scared for that, too. Nothing he does has ever been enough to convince me that as soon as I'm truly his in some poorly defined way, he won't stop wanting me. The older man's tone was matter-of-fact, but Eiji still had to work to keep his eyes from bulging. Zenji was still afraid. Zenji was still afraid. There was no hope for Eiji. I think sometimes about that line from Messiah, the one about how love drives away fear, Zenji continued. That's not been my experience. I've always found love terrifying. It's another knot I might never unpick. But things are better when I try to accept them both, the love and fear together. It's good with Bunta, better than I deserve. And I'm so glad I gave myself up to that awful tangle. I hope you can too. Finally, Zenji looked at Eiji again. His face was a little flushed, and his voice had a tight edge of self-consciousness, but he went on. So you see, I could tell you all day that the things you're afraid of won't happen, but I know it won't help. You'll still be afraid. Instead, I'm going to ask you to push forward with the understanding that your fear might never be any less. I think he might be right not to bed you right now, but you're also right to want it. You deserve to want someone, and tell him so. I promise that I know how terrifying it all is, so I hope you'll believe me when I say it's still worth it. It wasn't the same thing at all. Bunta was another human, and Lord Felix was a god, Eji's master. Zenji's life had never depended on Bunta's goodwill. Still, when the man talked about his lover, Eiji wondered if maybe it had felt like it did. Love was another point that Zenji had clearly given a great deal of thought, and he had given none at all. It seemed disrespectful to even consider the question of whether he could love Lord Felix. He worshipped his master, of course, and was awestruck and grateful for all he had seen fit to give Eiji. He was attracted to him. He looked forward to seeing him at the end of each day. Sometimes, when the god was excited or bashful, he felt a strange softness all through his chest, and when he read those wonderful notes... None of that mattered. What mattered were Lord Felix's feelings about him. His purpose was to please his master, not try to parse out all the ways. Even the thought was shocking, in which his master was pleasing to him. I've taken up too much of your time, he said, inclining his head. Thank you for indulging my foolish questions. Not foolish at all. Zenji's voice was a little shaky and breathless, and Eiji wondered guiltily whether he would be able to finish whatever task he'd interrupted. It's a genuine pleasure if I can help you. We went through something awful, you know? I don't think anyone else can ever really understand the exact ways it was awful. We ought to look out for each other. Eiji still couldn't quite bring himself to think of his time with Lord Antony as something awful, nor did he have an answer for his questions about Lord Felix. But as he walked back towards his master's room, he felt lighter, as if the tumultuous insides of his head had been aired out. He wouldn't use any of the phrases Zenji had suggested to him, at least not that night. But he knew that as soon as Lord Felix came back from his own work, there would still be smiles and conversation and kisses, even if those things scared him. And who knew? Maybe soon he would be brave enough to be a little shameless.